There are places on a map that are more than coordinates, they are warnings. In the thick, suffocating jungles of Binh Duong province, just 25 miles northwest of Saigon, there was one such place, the Iron Triangle, a twisted region of rice paddies, dense trees, and hidden horrors. American soldiers had a name for it, whispered in patrol camps and briefing rooms with more dread than anger. It was enemy territory, not just in theory but in spirit, and yet it was right under their nose. The Iron Triangle was not just a chunk of land, it was a war within the war. For years, this triangular zone, hemmed in by the Saigon and Thi Thien rivers, functioned as the beating heart of Viet Cong operations. Fighters came and went without warning, attacks were launched, ambushes were set, and U.S. troops sent in to probe the area often came back in pieces, or not at all. You see, this wasn't just jungle, it was a fortress, a phantom zone, and by early 1967, the American military had run out of patience. So they came up with a plan, not a raid, not a strike, an eradication. It would be called Operation Cedar Falls, the largest ground offensive of the Vietnam War up to that point. Over 30,000 American and South Vietnamese soldiers would descend on the Iron Triangle like a closing jaw. Their target? Total annihilation of the Viet Cong stronghold, village by village, tunnel by tunnel. It would be war at its most unforgiving. But as with so many brutal chapters in Vietnam, the operation would raise questions that no amount of firepower could answer. Before we dive into the tunnels, the battles, and the ghosts of Ben Suk, hit that subscribe button and give this story a like if you want more hard-hitting military history that cuts through the fog of war. Now, let's head into the jungle. In late 1966, the war in Vietnam was intensifying. American troops were pouring into the country at unprecedented rates, with nearly 400,000 boots on the ground. Yet despite the overwhelming military presence, the enemy remained elusive. In the jungles, in the villages, and especially in the Iron Triangle, the Viet Cong moved like shadows. They attacked and vanished. They built and rebuilt. They bled American units slowly and sometimes all at once. U.S. military leadership, particularly General William Westmoreland, had grown tired of this deadly cat-and-mouse game. They needed a demonstration, not just of strength, but of total dominance. Intelligence reports and prisoner interrogations pointed to one alarming truth. The Iron Triangle wasn't just a hideout, it was a strategic command center, a sanctuary where logistics, planning, and ideology were incubated in the safety of tunnels and sympathetic villages. The answer was clear. The region had to be cleared, flattened, and erased permanently. Thus, Operation Cedar Falls was born. It was named not for poetic reasons, but for bureaucratic consistency, part of the naming convention of operations in that region. But the name belied its magnitude. Cedar Falls would involve over 30,000 troops, the largest coordinated ground assault yet in the Vietnam War. Its blueprint called for a two-pronged offensive. First, an outer encirclement by American and ARVN forces to trap any Viet Cong fighters. Second, an internal sweep and destroy mission to root out infrastructure, weapons caches, and enemy tunnels. This wasn't a hit-and-run raid. This was a hammer and anvil strike, slow and deliberate, meant to crush everything in its path. The units involved read like a roll call of elite American might. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One. The 25th Infantry Division, the battle-hardened 100 Haas 73rd Airborne Brigade, and specialized ARVN Rangers. Support came from artillery, airstrikes, helicopters, and engineers. Even psychological warfare teams were deployed to blare propaganda over loudspeakers and drop leaflets in advance. But behind the cold tactics lay a hard, unsentimental truth. Villages would be leveled, civilians displaced, and jungle terrain scarred beyond recognition. There was no illusion about a clean war here. Cedar Falls was designed to erase a threat, not win hearts and minds. And the focal point of it all was a small village that barely appeared on maps. Ben Suk, quiet, remote, and, if the intelligence was right, the beating nerve center of the Viet Cong in the region. As helicopters began to rise into the air on January 8, 1967, Operation Cedar Falls was in motion. The largest hammer yet in America's war effort was about to fall. To the untrained eye, it was just another Vietnamese hamlet tucked deep in the foliage of the Iron Triangle. Mud brick huts, rice paddies, and the slow rhythm of rural life. But to U.S. intelligence, it was something far more sinister. A command post, a logistics hub, and a symbol of how deeply embedded the Viet Cong had become. When American troops approached Ben Suc in the early days of Operation Cedar Falls, they weren't expecting open resistance. And they didn't get it. While many military leaders justified the move as a counterinsurgency necessity, others, within and outside the military, saw it differently. Journalists on the ground reported scenes of frightened villagers separated from their homes with no warning, carried off in helicopters to unknown destinations. Families were broken up, community structures vanished overnight, and the refugee camps were often under-resourced, overcrowded, and vulnerable to exploitation. The deeper fear was this. By destroying Ben Suc, the U.S. had not cut off the Viet Cong's support base. It had expanded it. Many displaced villagers became more sympathetic to the insurgency, either out of resentment, desperation, or both. Hearts and minds, it seemed, were lost as fast as territory was gained. Even within the ranks, some U.S. soldiers questioned the mission. Was this how victory was measured? By how many tunnels collapsed? How many villages erased? For all its firepower, Cedar Falls had failed to address the political and psychological dimensions of the war, the ones that the Viet Cong exploited so effectively. What remained was a troubling paradox. Operation Cedar Falls had been one of the most logistically successful missions of the war, and yet it changed very little on the ground. The enemy adapted, the people suffered, and the jungle swallowed everything not nailed down. In hindsight, Cedar Falls became a case study in tactical brilliance paired with strategic blindness. It delivered destruction, not direction. Operation Cedar Falls was supposed to be a turning point, a message, a show of force so overwhelming that the Viet Cong would think twice before nesting in the Iron Triangle again. But in the end, its legacy was more complicated and far more sobering. On the surface, the operation demonstrated the incredible reach and coordination of American forces. It showed that the U.S. could deploy tens of thousands of troops, isolate a region, and sweep through with brutal precision. Tunnels were exposed, villages were cleared, intelligence was gathered. But the lessons that lasted weren't found in the body counts or the number of bunkers destroyed. They were found in what came next. Within a few months, Viet Cong fighters had returned to parts of the Iron Triangle. New tunnels were dug, support systems reestablished. The jungle healed faster than American planners had ever imagined, and the people, those who had once lived in Ben Suc and surrounding hamlets, had become refugees, many embittered, some radicalized. The destruction of Ben Suc became a symbol. For many critics, it represented the moral failure of American strategy in Vietnam, that by destroying what they couldn't control, U.S. forces risked becoming indistinguishable from the very enemy they sought to defeat. Cedar Falls didn't break the Viet Cong. It revealed them as a movement not defined by fixed positions or large armies, but by their ability to vanish, adapt, and outlast. It also revealed the limits of American power, the futility of trying to win a war of ideology and allegiance with bombs and bulldozers. The operation's aftermath haunted military planners for years. Lessons learned at Ben Suc were revisited during the later offensives like Operation Junction City and the Tet Offensive. Some adapted, others ignored them. In the long view of history, Operation Cedar Falls stands as a grim monument to the war's complexity, a mission that achieved everything it set out to on paper, and yet left the war unchanged. It reminds us of a painful truth. You can crush a tunnel, you can burn a village, but if you haven't won the trust of the people, all you've really done is clear the ground for the next fight. Thanks for watching. If this deep dive into one of the Vietnam War's most intense operations gripped you, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps. And if you want more raw, powerful history brought to life, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. See you in the next story. Stay sharp. Even as the smoke cleared, reports whispered that the Viet Cong had already begun rebuilding elsewhere, melting back into jungles and tunnels beyond the blast radius. Ben Suc was gone, but the war was far from over. By the second week of Operation Cedar Falls, the jungle above was being pounded by artillery, napalm, and bulldozers. But beneath it, an entirely different war was being fought. One fought not with tanks or airstrikes, but with flashlights, pistols, and nerves of steel. The tunnel rats had arrived. These were volunteers, typically small-frame men who could squeeze through the Viet Cong's underground network. Armed with only a flashlight, a .45 pistol, and a knife, they descended into a blackness that defied imagination. There were no maps, no backup. Every tunnel could be a trap. Every shadow could be death. And still they went in. The tunnel systems beneath the Iron Triangle were not crude hideouts. They were multi-level labyrinths, stretching for over 100 miles, some reaching depths of 30 feet or more. Into them, the Viet Cong had carved out barracks, kitchens, weapons depots, and even classrooms for indoctrination. Underground hospitals treated wounded fighters. Command centers issued orders. In some areas, families lived, cooked, and fought without ever surfacing. It was an underground city, hidden in plain sight. The tunnel rats had to fight inch by inch. Booby traps were everywhere. Tripwire grenades, punji sticks, false walls, and trapdoors that dropped intruders onto spikes. There were even rumors, later confirmed, of venomous snakes sealed in ceramic jars, placed like biological mines in dead-end tunnels. But even worse than the traps was the psychological pressure. Imagine crawling for hours in a space no wider than your shoulders. Pitch black, suffocating air. Any noise could mean an ambush. Any wrong turn could mean you'd never come out again. The enemy knew these tunnels by heart. You did not. Many tunnel rats emerged shaken, drenched in sweat, coughing from mold and dust. Others didn't emerge at all. Still, the operation yielded results. American forces uncovered vast caches of weapons, AK-47s, mortars, RPGs, and ammunition. They found documents, maps, and propaganda materials, including newspapers and training manuals written in multiple languages. They discovered how deep and organized the insurgency truly was. Engineers began collapsing the tunnels with C4 and gasoline. But it was slow work and often dangerous. Some of the tunnels were too deep or branched into undiscovered sectors. Others had emergency exits that let fighters escape just before the detonations. And even as they collapsed one section, it was whispered that the Viet Cong were already rebuilding two more. The jungle above could be burned. Villages could be flattened. But underground, the war persisted. The tunnel war in the Iron Triangle wasn't just a military encounter, it was a revelation. It showed the U.S. command how underestimated the enemy had been. The Viet Cong didn't just survive. They thrived in the shadows, turning earth and sweat into a resistance no bomb could reach. For every tunnel destroyed, there were more. And for every rat who crawled into the darkness, there were ghosts still waiting below. By the time Operation Cedar Falls officially ended on January 26, 1967, the numbers looked impressive on paper. The U.S. military claimed it had killed over 750 Viet Cong fighters, captured hundreds of weapons, destroyed tons of food and ammunition, and obliterated a major insurgent sanctuary. Over 6,000 civilians were evacuated, and the infamous village of Ben Suc, once the beating heart of the Iron Triangle, was gone. To General Westmoreland and his staff, Cedar Falls was a clear success. It was a textbook search and destroy mission, scaled up to historic proportions, and it proved that American forces could mobilize quickly, strike hard, and dominate a hostile region. But beneath those victory claims, troubling questions lingered. For starters, much of the Viet Cong's core force had already vanished before the operation began. Whether tipped off by informants or simply skilled in reading the signs of war, they melted into the jungle, regrouping elsewhere. The underground systems were disrupted, but not annihilated. Within months, portions of the Iron Triangle were once again under Viet Cong influence. The jungle regrew, the tunnels reopened, the war simply shifted to a lower gear, waiting for the next offensive. Then there was the issue of the civilian population. The evacuation of Ben Suc wasn't a footnote, it was a flashpoint. The destruction of homes and the forced displacement of thousands of Vietnamese civilians sparked a wave of criticism. While many military leaders justified the move as a counter-insurgency necessity, others, within and outside the military, saw it differently. The village was eerily quiet. No gunfire, no ambush. It felt wrong. Soldiers swept through the houses, expecting firefights in every corner. But what they found was more unnerving. This wasn't a simple farming village. It was a fortress in disguise. Hidden just beneath the surface, Ben Suk was a military complex. American engineers and tunnel rats, small, agile soldiers trained to explore subterranean networks, began to peel back the layers. What they uncovered was astonishing. There were bunkers and reinforced shelters, big enough to house dozens of fighters. Tunnels branched off in every direction, forming an underground highway system. Medical facilities, supply caches, and even printing presses for propaganda were discovered. This wasn't just a hiding place, it was a functioning, organized base of operations, invisible from above and nearly unreachable from the surface. Some tunnels were 3 levels deep, and they weren't random. They had air ventilation, booby traps, escape routes. These were the result of years of engineering, with Viet Cong guerrillas using little more than shovels, hands, and human endurance. In some spots, the enemy had embedded grenades in the walls, disguised false doors, and even clay jars filled with poisonous snakes, a living trap for any intruder. But the biggest shock? The Viet Cong were gone. They had vanished before the American hammer landed. Whether warned by informants or simply sensing the coming storm, they had slipped away into the countryside, taking their core fighters with them. What remained was their infrastructure and their legend. Still, the mission pushed forward. Engineers documented and photographed the vast network. Weapons were seized. Maps and intelligence were extracted from hidden compartments. American troops began destroying what they could, collapsing tunnels with explosives, torching supply stores, rigging caves with C4. But the most difficult part wasn't beneath the ground. It was walking among the civilians, nearly 6,000 people who called Ben Suk home. Many of them, U.S. commanders believed, had supported the Viet Cong, willingly or otherwise. But now they were caught in the crossfire of a war that gave little room for neutrality. Orders were given, evacuation plans were drawn. The mission was far from over, but Ben Suk had just become the moral crucible of Operation Cedar Falls. And soon it would become a crater on the map. Ben Suk wasn't just a village, it was a home, a place where children played near rice paddies, where elders tended shrines, where life had continued despite the war crawling through the jungle outside. But in January 1967, that life came to a halt. The American command made a fateful decision. Ben Suk could not be allowed to exist any longer. They didn't trust that the village could be held. Too remote, too loyal to the Viet Cong. Intelligence painted a picture of civilians acting as lookouts, hiding weapons, passing messages. Whether the support was voluntary or coerced didn't matter anymore. On military maps, Ben Suk was now classified as unsalvageable. The evacuation began almost immediately. American troops moved through the village with orders to relocate every man, woman, and child. Helicopters thundered in, trucks rumbled down makeshift roads, and villagers, confused, scared, often defiant, were herded from their homes. Some resisted, some pleaded, others remained eerily silent, resigned to the wave of war sweeping through their lives. Over the next few days, more than 6,000 civilians were forcibly evacuated from Ben Suk and surrounding hamlets. Some were taken south to refugee camps near Saigon, fenced areas with tents and rations, often guarded by soldiers. Others were scattered into rural regions where they would try to rebuild their lives. Many never would. Then came the final act. U.S. Army engineers moved in with demolition charges, bulldozers, and flamethrowers. Every structure in Ben Suk was destroyed. Huts were burned, storage depots rigged to explode, and tunnels collapsed with explosives. Even the water wells were filled in. By the end, there was nothing left, not even rubble, just churned earth and silence. Ben Suk was wiped off the map, literally. American maps of the region erased its name, replacing it with neutral grid coordinates. It had become a ghost, a memory scorched into strategy. To military planners, this was necessary warfare. The village had been a cancer growing beneath their lines, and now it was removed. Clean, controlled. But to many others, journalists, human rights observers, even some within the military, the destruction of Ben Suk was a moral disaster. They questioned the logic of punishing an entire population to root out a hidden enemy. They feared that by destroying homes, America had sown more rebellion than it had crushed. And in the long run, they may have been right.